In the shadows of a world torn asunder by war, a German spy in America comes face to face with a shocking revelation that could change the course of history. As he navigates a labyrinth of espionage and deception, he must confront the ultimate choice between duty and humanity. In a race against time, where each decision could be his last, will he choose the path of destruction or redemption? Berlin, 1943. Erich Weber stood amidst the ruins of what was once a vibrant city, the capital of his beloved fatherland. Berlin was now a shadow of its former self, pockmarked with craters and lined with the skeletal remains of buildings. The acrid smell of smoke hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the relentless Allied bombings. Erich, a young intelligence officer, was dressed in a civilian suit instead of his uniform, his usual attire replaced to prepare for a mission unlike any other. As he waited in the shadow of a crumbling church, his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. He had been chosen for a critical task, to infiltrate America and gather intelligence that could turn the tide of the war in favor of Germany. It was a mission of immense honor, yet, as he looked around at the suffering and destruction, doubts began to gnaw at him. Was this war, with all its devastation, really worth the cost? The sound of approaching footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. His contact, a gaunt man with sharp features named Müller, arrived with a brief nod, handing Erich a small, weathered suitcase. "Everything you need is in here," Müller whispered, glancing around nervously. "Your papers, money, and further instructions. Remember, once you reach America, you're Hans Müller, a Swiss businessman. Trust no one." Erich took the suitcase, feeling the weight of his new identity. He had been trained to lie, to deceive, but assuming a completely new persona was daunting. He was no longer Erich Weber, the son of a proud Berliner family. He was now Hans Müller, a neutral party in a world torn apart by war. As he boarded the U-boat that would stealthily take him across the Atlantic, Erich took one last look at the city. The once grand buildings were now mere skeletons. The streets that used to echo with laughter were now silent, and the people, his people, were shadows of their former selves, hardened by years of conflict. The stark reality of war's destruction settled deep in his heart. The journey was long and fraught with danger. Every creak and groan of the U-boat's hull reminded him of the perilous journey ahead. The Atlantic was a battleground, with Allied ships hunting for the likes of him. But amidst the fear and anticipation there was a part of him, buried deep, that felt relief. Relief at escaping the constant bombings, the hunger, and the despair that had become his daily life. Days turned into nights, and nights back into days as the U-boat made its stealthy way across the ocean. Erich spent hours studying his new identity, memorizing every detail of Hans Müller's life. He rehearsed his cover story until it felt almost real, imagining the bustling streets of New York, a world away from the destruction of Berlin. Yet, as America drew closer, so did his apprehension. He had heard stories of the country's vast resources and determined people. Could Germany really defeat such a giant? The thought lingered in his mind, an unwelcome specter casting a long shadow over his mission. When land was finally sighted, it wasn't with triumph that Erich's heart swelled, but with an inexplicable sense of foreboding. As he disembarked, disguised among the crowd of weary travelers, the skyline of New York loomed in the distance, a stark reminder of the colossal task ahead. And it was there, standing on the threshold of a new world, that Erich Weber, now Hans Müller, realized the war's true scale. It was a moment of clarity that would haunt him throughout his mission, a seed of doubt that would grow with every step he took on American soil. For as he gazed upon the land of the free, a nagging thought whispered in the back of his mind, chilling him to the bone. "We are going to lose this war." The U-boat that carried Erich Weber, now Hans Müller, and a few others like him, was a silent predator of the deep. It slithered through the vast Atlantic, avoiding detection by the ever-vigilant Allied Navy. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, every man aware of the lethal danger that prowled above the waves. The cramped, claustrophobic conditions of the submarine were a stark contrast to the open skies of Berlin, yet, in some ways, equally oppressive. Erich tried to keep to himself, spending long hours poring over the details of his cover story or staring at the cold metal walls that confined him. The gentle hum of the submarine's engines was a constant companion, a reminder that he was moving further away from the war-torn streets of his homeland and closer to the daunting task that lay ahead. As the days passed, the U-boat occasionally surfaced under the cover of darkness to gulp fresh air, a rare luxury. Erich savored these moments, feeling the cool night breeze on his face, looking up at the stars that shone with an indifferent light. They were the same stars that shone over America, over the bustling cities and quiet towns he was about to infiltrate. It was a humbling thought, one that made him realize the insignificance of his own existence amidst the vastness of the world. The journey was not just a physical one but a mental ordeal. The isolation allowed Erich's thoughts to wander, often taking him back to his life before the war. He remembered his family, his friends, and the dreams he once had. The war had changed everything, turning aspirations into dust. Now, he was a shadow, a man living a lie, sent on a mission that he increasingly viewed with skepticism. Despite his doubts, Erich knew that failure was not an option. The lives of his family and the fate of his country hinged on his success. The burden weighed heavily on him, a constant pressure that never eased. Yet, in the quiet moments of introspection, he wondered what victory even meant anymore. Was it worth the destruction, the endless loss of life? These thoughts were quickly suppressed, dangerous in their potential to derail his mission. As the U-boat neared the American coast, the tension among the crew became palpable. They were entering enemy waters, where the risk of discovery was greatest. Every man was on edge, knowing that a single mistake could lead to their doom. Erich felt the fear, a cold, gripping sensation, but he also felt a strange sense of anticipation. After weeks of confinement, he was eager to step onto solid ground, to begin the mission he had been trained for. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the coast of America appeared on the horizon. It was a sight that brought mixed emotions: relief at having survived the perilous journey across the Atlantic, apprehension about the formidable task ahead, and an inexplicable sense of loss, knowing that he might never see his homeland again. The U-boat docked at a secluded spot away from prying eyes. One by one, the passengers disembarked, each man a solitary figure disappearing into the night. When it was Erich's turn, he took a deep breath, clutching the small suitcase that contained his new identity. As he stepped onto the American soil, a feeling of resolve settled over him. He was no longer Erich Weber, the German intelligence officer. He was Hans Müller, a Swiss businessman. It was time to blend in, to become a part of the country he was sent to deceive. And as he walked away from the coastline, disappearing into the shadows of the night, the real journey began. A journey not just across physical distances, but across moral boundaries. A journey that would test him in ways he never imagined. For in the land of the free, Erich Weber would come to understand the true cost of war and the price of his own humanity. Erich, as Hans Müller, stepped off the bus into the bustling streets of New York City. The skyline towered above him, a forest of steel and concrete that stretched into the heavens. It was a world apart from the bombed-out remains of Berlin, a city pulsing with life and energy. The air was filled with the sounds of honking cars, chattering crowds, and the distant echo of a jazz band. The smell of street food mingled with the exhaust fumes, creating a scent that was distinctly urban. As he navigated through the throngs of people, Erich felt an overwhelming sense of anonymity. Here, he was just another face in the crowd, a stranger among millions. It was both liberating and disconcerting. Back home, he had been someone. Here, he was no one. Yet, it was this very obscurity that would shield him, allowing him to carry out his mission unnoticed. Erich had been provided with an address in the Lower East Side, where he would stay under the guise of a businessman seeking new opportunities. The apartment was small and modest, a far cry from the grandeur of Berlin's pre-war buildings, but it was comfortable and, more importantly, safe. As days turned into weeks, Erich began to immerse himself in American society. He adopted the local customs, improved his English, and even developed a taste for baseball. He worked at a nearby factory during the day, using his mechanical skills to blend in. The factory was a hive of activity, filled with men and women of all ages, all working tirelessly for the war effort. It was here that Erich first witnessed the indomitable American spirit, a stark contrast to the weary resignation he had left behind. Yet it was not just the people that struck him, it was the sheer scale of everything. The buildings were taller, the streets wider, and the portions larger. America was a land of abundance, even in wartime. The shops were stocked with goods, and while there were rations and restrictions, there was no sense of the dire scarcity that plagued Germany. Erich spent his evenings exploring the city, walking along the Hudson River or wandering through Central Park. He visited museums, libraries, and theaters, marveling at the cultural richness of the city. He saw films that made him laugh, plays that moved him to tears, and artworks that stirred his soul. It was a side of life he had almost forgotten, a reminder of what peace and prosperity could bring. Yet, amid the awe and wonder, a sense of unease began to grow within him. As he witnessed the Americans' daily lives, their determination and unity, he started to question the purpose of his mission. How could Germany hope to defeat a nation so vast, so full of life? The doubt that had first taken root on the U-boat began to grow, spreading like a shadow across his heart. Despite this, Erich continued to gather information, sending coded messages back to Germany. He reported on the factory's production, the morale of the people, and the military movements. Yet, with each report, he felt a growing sense of futility. It was like trying to hold back the ocean with his bare hands. One evening, as he sat in a small cafe watching the world go by, he overheard a conversation between two men at the next table. They were discussing the war, talking about the recent victories in Europe and the inevitable defeat of Germany. Erich listened intently, a knot forming in his stomach. The men spoke with such certainty, such conviction. It was a reflection of the national sentiment, a belief that victory was not just hoped for but assured. It was at that moment that Erich truly understood the enormity of his task and the likely futility of it all. As he walked back to his apartment, the city lights blurring into a cascade of color, he felt a profound sense of isolation. He was alone in a foreign land, surrounded by an enemy that didn't even know he existed. And as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, a single thought echoed in his mind, a thought that would haunt him in the days to come. We are going to lose this war. Months passed as Erich, known to those around him as Hans Müller, became a fixture in the local community. He continued working at the factory, his hands and face grimy with the daily toil, a stark contrast to his previous life as an officer. Yet, it was during the nights, under the guise of socializing, that his real work took place. He frequented bars and cafes, striking up conversations, always listening, always observing. The bits and pieces of information he gathered were like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, each one adding to the overall picture of America's war effort. His apartment became a clandestine base of operations. Maps were hidden between the pages of innocuous books, and coded messages were carefully drafted under the dim light of a single bulb. Each transmission sent to Germany was a risk, but it was a risk he was compelled to take. The information he provided was vital, or so he was told. Yet, with each report, the doubt that plagued him grew stronger. Erich's life was a constant balancing act, a perpetual tension between his mission and the burgeoning realization of its futility. He had seen the might of the American war machine, the endless production of arms and equipment, the streams of young men and women signing up to serve. It was a nation mobilized for total war, and the scale of it was unlike anything he had ever imagined. As he delved deeper into his role, Erich found himself playing the part of Hans Müller with increasing ease. He had even made friends, people who knew him as the affable Swiss businessman with a keen interest in American culture. Among them was Clara, a young journalist with a sharp mind and a kind heart. She was passionate about the war effort, writing articles that rallied the public spirit. Erich admired her, even as he envied the simplicity of her convictions. Clara introduced him to a different side of America, one where people discussed the future with optimism, where the dream of peace and prosperity was not just a fleeting hope, but an inevitable reality. They spent long evenings talking about everything from literature to politics. Erich found himself looking forward to these moments, a brief respite from the loneliness and duplicity of his existence. Yet, as their friendship grew, so did the risk. Clara was well connected, her work giving her access to information that was of great interest to Erich. He knew he should exploit this, use her trust to further his mission. But something held him back. It was a sense of guilt, a realization that he was not just lying to an enemy, but betraying a friend. One evening, as they sat in a small diner, the conversation turned to the war. Clara spoke passionately about the need for victory, about the sacrifices being made by everyone. Her eyes shone with a fervent light, and Erich felt a pang of something he couldn't quite identify. It was as if he was seeing the war through her eyes, feeling the collective hope and determination of an entire nation. And it was in that moment that the full weight of his duplicity hit him. He was not just a spy. He was an intruder in the lives of these people, a shadow among the light. The information he sent to Germany was not just data. It was a betrayal of every person who had shown him kindness, every friend who had welcomed him into their home. As he walked Clara home that night, the streets of New York stretched out before them, a tapestry of light and shadow. Erich felt a profound sense of isolation. He was caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. The man he once was, the loyal officer of the Reich, seemed like a distant memory, a ghost of a past that was slowly fading away. And as he bid Clara good night, watching her disappear into her building, he realized that his mission was not just a test of loyalty to his country, but a test of his own humanity. For in the heart of enemy territory, surrounded by a people he had come to admire, Erich Weber was beginning to understand the true cost of war. It was a cost measured not in bullets and bombs, but in the hearts and souls of men. And it was a price he was no longer sure he was willing to pay. The chill of autumn had settled over New York, the leaves turning brilliant shades of orange and red. Life in the city marched on with the same relentless pace, but for Erich, the world seemed to slow down the day he received the letter. It was from his sister, Ingrid, a rare and dangerous correspondence that managed to find its way to him through a network of covert contacts. As he sat in the privacy of his apartment, the letter trembled in his hands. The words blurred as he read about the relentless bombing raids over Berlin, the nights spent in shelters, and the constant fear that gripped the city. But nothing prepared him for the news of his parents' death, caught in a bombing that reduced their family home to rubble. The pain was sharp and immediate, a wound that cut deeper than anything he had ever felt. For days, Erich moved through his routines like a ghost, his thoughts a whirlwind of grief and guilt. He had left his family to serve his country, believing in the righteousness of their cause. But now, as he faced the staggering loss, the purpose of his mission, the very cause he served seemed to crumble before his eyes. The factory, once a place where he could lose himself in the anonymity of labor, now felt suffocating. The clanging of machinery and the chatter of his co-workers echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the life that went on while his world had come crashing down. He found no solace in his work, no distraction from the grief that haunted him. Clara noticed the change in him. Her concern was evident. Her attempts to reach out met with a polite but firm distance. Erich could not bring himself to share his loss with her, to burden her with the weight of his sorrow. He feared that revealing his pain would crack the facade he had so carefully built, exposing the truth he worked so hard to conceal. One evening, as they sat in a quiet corner of their favorite diner, Clara gently pressed him to open up. "You've been distant, Hans," she said, using the name she knew him by. "Whatever it is, you can tell me. We all have our burdens to bear, especially now." Erich looked at her, the kindness in her eyes a stark contrast to the turmoil within him. He wanted to tell her everything, to share the crushing weight of his grief, but he remained silent, the lies that separated them a chasm too wide to cross. As the days turned into weeks, Erich's resolve began to falter. The relentless energy of New York, the ever-present symbols of American strength and unity, only served to deepen his despair. The war seemed to be a distant, almost abstract concept, yet its consequences were brutally real. He began to take long walks at night, wandering the streets aimlessly, lost in thought. The city's towering buildings loomed over him, the bright lights casting long shadows. He walked for miles, his mind racing with the memories of his parents, the images of his shattered home, and the constant, gnawing doubt about the war's purpose and end. It was on one of these walks that he made his way to the Hudson River, the vast expanse of water reflecting the city's lights. He stood there for a long time, watching the gentle ebb and flow of the waves. The river, indifferent to his sorrow, flowed on, a reminder of the world's relentless march forward. As he turned to walk back to his apartment, a sense of resolve settled over him. He could no longer ignore the doubts that plagued him, the growing realization of the war's futility. The loss of his family, the destruction of his home, had stripped away the illusions he held about the righteousness of his cause. He was no longer sure what he was fighting for, or if it was worth the price. Erich knew that the path ahead would be fraught with danger, that his next steps could lead to disaster. But as he walked back through the sleeping city, he felt a determination growing within him, a need to find the truth amidst the lies, to make sense of the senseless loss. For the first time since he arrived in America, Erich Weber began to see a path forward, a way to reconcile the war's harsh realities with the lingering hope for peace. The autumn turned to a biting winter, and New York donned a blanket of snow. The city, ever resilient, adapted to the cold, its inhabitants moving with a brisk urgency that matched the chilly air. Erich, too, found himself moving with a renewed purpose, albeit one that filled him with trepidation. The weight of his secret sorrow and the growing disillusionment with his mission compelled him to look for answers, to seek some semblance of truth amid the war's chaos. It was during one of his shifts at the factory that Erich overheard a conversation that would change everything. Two engineers, their voices hushed and grave, discussed a project so secretive and so monumental that it seemed almost fantastical. They spoke of the Manhattan Project, a name that meant nothing to Erich at the time, but the snippets of conversation about unprecedented destructive power and a new type of bomb sent a chill down his spine. Determined to learn more, Erich used his evenings to frequent places where scientists and engineers gathered, posing as a curious businessman fascinated by American innovation. His efforts paid off when he befriended a junior physicist who, perhaps naively, divulged more about the project over drinks. The United States, with the help of its allies, was developing an atomic bomb, a weapon that could end the war and change the world forever. Erich's mind raced as he processed the information. The implications were catastrophic. If the Allies succeeded in creating and using such a weapon, not only would Germany face certain defeat, but the very nature of warfare would change. The prospect of such immense destruction was horrifying, and for the first time since his arrival, Erich questioned not just the feasibility of his mission, but its morality. Tormented by his discovery, Erich became more withdrawn, his interactions with his friends and co-workers perfunctory and strained. He avoided Clara, knowing that her perceptive gaze would see through his troubled facade. The burden of his knowledge was his alone to bear, a secret too dangerous to share. As the winter thawed into a tentative spring, Erich wrestled with his conscience. He was a soldier, sworn to serve his country, but the thought of contributing to a war that might unleash such a terrifying new force upon the world filled him with dread. He pondered sending a coded message to his superiors about the Manhattan Project, but hesitated, unsure of the consequences. One evening, as he sat at his desk, surrounded by the dim light of his apartment, a realization dawned upon him. His mission, perhaps even the war itself, was a path to destruction, one that he no longer wanted to walk. The sorrow of his personal loss mingled with the fear for humanity's future, leading him to a decision that once would have been unthinkable. Erich decided to defect. He would leave behind Hans Müller, the Swiss businessman, and embrace Erich Weber once again, but this time as a man determined to prevent further loss and suffering. It was a perilous plan, one that would expose him to immense danger, but the thought of sitting idly by while the world teetered on the brink of atomic warfare was unbearable. He began to make careful preparations, gathering the little money he had saved, securing a small revolver for protection, and planning a route that would take him away from New York, away from the life he had built as a spy. Each step was fraught with risk, but Erich moved with a clarity of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. The night before he intended to leave, Erich made one final visit to Clara. He couldn't tell her the truth, but he needed to see her one last time, to remember the brief moments of joy they had shared. They met at their usual diner, the neon sign outside casting a warm glow over their table. Clara sensed his melancholy, mistaking it for the usual wartime dread. They talked of trivial things, avoiding the grim reality that loomed outside. When it was time to leave, they stood outside, the city's noise a distant backdrop to their quiet farewell. "Take care, Hans," Clara said, her eyes searching his. "Whatever is troubling you, remember, this war won't last forever. There's a future waiting for us, a peaceful one. You'll see." Erich nodded, the weight of his secret pressing down on him. "Take care, Clara," he replied, his voice barely more than a whisper. They parted with a final, lingering look, two souls briefly connected in a world torn apart by conflict. As Erich walked away, the reality of his decision settled in. He was leaving behind not just a city, but a life filled with contradictions and lies. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the slim hope of redemption. But as the streets of New York faded into the darkness behind him, Erich Weber stepped forward, a man determined to right the wrongs of his past, and perhaps, in doing so, change the course of the future. The dawn was breaking, casting a pale light over the city that had been Erich's home and theater of deception for many months. He had left his apartment for the last time, carrying nothing but the essentials and the heavy burden of his impending defection. Each step was measured, each glance cautious. He was a man on the brink, teetering between two worlds with profound uncertainty. As he made his way through the still sleeping streets, a part of him ached for the life he was leaving behind. The friendships he had formed, particularly with Clara, were the only genuine part of his existence in America. Yet he knew that his relationship with her was built on a foundation of lies, a fragile construct that could crumble at any moment. Unknown to Erich, his decision to defect had set in motion a series of events that would soon converge with devastating clarity. Clara, ever perceptive and concerned about the change in Erich's demeanor, had started her own quiet investigation. Her intuition told her that something was amiss, a puzzle that her journalistic mind needed to solve. Her breakthrough came unexpectedly when she encountered one of Erich's co-workers from the factory, who offhandedly mentioned Erich's remarkable knowledge of engineering and mechanics, details that didn't fit with his supposed background as a businessman. This discrepancy led Clara down a rabbit hole, pulling at threads that slowly unraveled Erich's carefully constructed identity. As the truth dawned on her, Clara was faced with a dilemma that cut to the core of her beliefs. Erich, the man she had come to know and care for, was a German spy. The implications were staggering, not just for their relationship, but for the safety and security of her country. Torn between her sense of duty and her feelings for Erich, Clara made a decision. She would confront him, offer him a chance to explain, perhaps even to seek redemption. She hurried through the streets, hoping to catch him before he disappeared into the unknown. Meanwhile, Erich, oblivious to Clara's discovery, continued his cautious journey towards the outskirts of the city. He was close to the rendezvous point, a secluded area where he planned to meet a contact that could help him escape. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Clara found him just as he was about to turn a corner, her voice a mixture of desperation and resolve. "Hans, or should I say, Erich?" Her words stopped him in his tracks, a cold realization washing over him. He turned to face her, the truth of his identity laid bare between them. The confrontation was tense, fraught with emotion and the palpable sense of betrayal. Clara demanded answers, her journalistic instincts melding with a sense of personal hurt. Erich, for his part, was cornered, his plans for defection suddenly in jeopardy. But more than that, he was confronted with the pain he had caused, the trust he had broken. He confessed everything, the mission, his true identity, and most importantly, the discovery of the Manhattan Project and his decision to defect. He spoke of the war's toll, the loss of his family, and the hopelessness he felt about the conflict's outcome. His words were a torrent, a mixture of guilt, despair, and a desperate plea for understanding. Clara listened, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, sympathy, and confusion. Here was a man she thought she knew, revealing himself to be an enemy, yet also a victim of the same war that ravaged her world. His confession, while shocking, also painted a picture of a deeply conflicted individual caught in the gears of a war much larger than himself. In the end, Clara made a choice. She could not condone what Erich had done, nor could she ignore the threat he posed. But she also saw the man behind the spy, the human being who had been twisted and broken by the war. She told him to go, to disappear before she would report him, giving him a chance to find the redemption he sought. As they parted, the early morning light casting long shadows on the street, a complex web of emotions hung between them. Betrayal, loss, and a sliver of hope mingled in the air. Erich, now truly alone, continued his journey, the image of Clara's conflicted face etched into his memory. And Clara, left standing in the quiet street, watched him go, her heart heavy with a profound sense of sorrow and the lingering question of whether she had done the right thing. The war, with all its gray shades and moral complexities, had intruded into her life, leaving a mark that would forever change her understanding of right and wrong, friend and foe. In the weeks following his fateful confrontation with Clara, Erich continued his precarious existence, moving from place to place, staying one step ahead of the authorities he was sure would soon be on his trail. The once vibrant New York had become a labyrinth of shadows and suspicion, each stranger a potential enemy, each step fraught with danger. The news of the Allied invasion of Normandy reached him in a dingy motel room on the outskirts of the city. The radio crackled with reports of the massive operation, a daring assault that marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. As he listened, a complex tapestry of emotions unfurled within him: hope, fear, and a deep sense of longing for the home he might never see again. The success of D-Day was a turning point in the war, a clear signal that the tide had turned against the Axis powers. Erich understood the implications all too well: the sheer scale and audacity of the invasion, the unity of purpose among the Allied nations, and the indomitable spirit of the soldiers who stormed the beaches were a testament to the power and resolve he had witnessed during his time in America. As the days passed and the Allies advanced, liberating towns and cities that had been under the yoke of Nazi rule, Erich felt a growing sense of detachment from the cause he had once served. The reports of atrocities, the stories of suffering, all painted a picture of a regime that had lost its humanity in pursuit of power. Despite his initial mission to gather intelligence for this very regime, Erich now found himself rooting for the Allied soldiers, hoping for a swift end to the conflict that had consumed so much of his life. It was a strange and disconcerting feeling, one that he wrestled with in the solitude of his hiding places. But even as he grappled with these emotions, the practicalities of survival demanded his attention. He had to move constantly, using a network of contacts he had built over the months to stay one step ahead of capture. He avoided large cities, sticking to small towns and rural areas where he could blend in and avoid attention. Throughout this time, Clara's decision to let him go haunted him. Her act of mercy was a constant reminder of the personal connections he had severed, the lives he had touched and then left behind. He wondered what she was doing, whether she ever thought of him, and whether she regretted her choice. But there was little time for reflection. As the war drew to a close with Germany's defeat imminent, the net around him tightened. News of the death of Hitler, the surrender of German forces, and the celebrations in the streets of America reached him in snippets, each piece of information a stark reminder of the new world that awaited. Erich knew that his days of running were numbered. He had avoided capture so far, but the end of the war would bring a renewed focus on hunting down spies and collaborators. He needed a plan, a way to end his flight and start anew. As the war in Europe officially ended, with VE Day declared and jubilant crowds filling the streets of Allied cities, Erich made a decision. He would surrender to the American authorities, confess his past, and provide whatever information he could about German intelligence operations. It was a risky move, one that could lead to imprisonment or worse, but it was a chance he was willing to take for the possibility of peace and redemption. So, with a heavy heart and a mind filled with uncertainty, Erich walked into the nearest FBI office, his fate hanging in the balance. As he told his story to the agents who listened with a mixture of skepticism and interest, he felt a strange sense of relief. The weight of his double life, the lies, and the fear all seemed to lift from his shoulders. And as he was taken into custody, his future uncertain, Erich knew that the war was over for him. He had played his part, for better or for worse, and now it was time to face the consequences. The world had changed, and so had he, in ways he could never have imagined when he first set foot in America. But as he looked out of the window of the interrogation room at the city that had been both his battleground and his sanctuary, he felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for a new beginning. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Erich Weber, once a shadowy figure navigating the streets of New York, was now a prisoner of war, held in a detention center awaiting his fate. The cell was sparse and cold, a stark contrast to the freedom he had enjoyed, even as a man on the run. Yet, within these walls, he found a strange sense of peace, the chaotic uncertainty of his life replaced by the monotonous predictability of captivity. As he sat on the hard cot, staring at the gray walls, Erich had time to reflect on his journey. He thought of Berlin, of the proud and beautiful city that had been reduced to rubble, of his family lost in the relentless bombings, and of the ideals he had once held so dear, now shattered by the harsh light of reality. His mission, once a source of pride, now seemed like a distant folly, a path chosen by a younger, more naive version of himself. He thought of Clara, the woman who had shown him kindness and understanding, who had seen through the lies to the man beneath. Her face, etched with the complex emotions of their last meeting, haunted him. He wondered what she thought of him now, whether she remembered him with anger, pity, or perhaps a hint of the affection they had once shared. The end of the war had brought little comfort to Erich. The news of Germany's defeat, the horrific revelations of the concentration camps, and the total collapse of the world he had known were overwhelming. He felt a deep sense of guilt and shame, not just for his own actions, but for the atrocities committed in his country's name. As the days passed, Erich was interrogated by various officers, his knowledge of German intelligence sought after by those seeking to understand and dismantle the remnants of the Nazi regime. He cooperated fully, providing whatever information he could, driven by a desire to make amends, however small, for his part in the war. Yet, despite his cooperation, the future was uncertain. He was a former enemy combatant, a spy who had lived among the very people he was sent to deceive. Trust was a luxury he could not afford, and his fate rested in the hands of those who had every reason to doubt his sincerity. But as he lay in his cell each night, listening to the distant sounds of the compound, Erich found himself thinking less of the past and more of the future. The war had changed him, stripping away the illusions of youth and leaving a man who understood the complexity of the world in a way he never had before. He dreamed of a second chance, an opportunity to rebuild his life in this new world, to find a purpose that went beyond the orders of superiors and the ideology of a fallen regime. He thought of the people he had met in America, of the spirit and resilience that had both awed and humbled him. He realized that, despite everything, he had come to admire and even love the country that had been his enemy. It was a confusing, complex feeling, but it was real, a flicker of light in the darkness that had consumed so much of his life. As the war in the Pacific finally came to an end, with the devastating use of the atomic bombs he had once heard whispers about, Erich knew that the world was forever changed. The old order had been swept away, and a new era was beginning, one filled with both daunting challenges and boundless possibilities. And as he faced the uncertain future, Erich Weber, the man who had once believed in the invincibility of his country, now believed in something far more powerful, the capacity for change, for redemption, and for hope. It was a belief not born of naivety, but of the hard-earned wisdom of a man who had seen the best and worst of humanity, who had lived a life of shadows and lies, and who now longed for nothing more than the simple, unvarnished truth. After months of uncertainty, the trials and tribulations of war tribunals began to settle. Erich Weber was not charged with crimes of aggression. His cooperation and the minor nature of his intelligence work afforded him a semblance of clemency. Instead, he was to remain in America, a displaced person in a land that was once his target. The war had ended, but for Erich, a new chapter was just beginning. He moved to a small town in the Midwestern United States, a place where the rolling fields and open skies offered him a sense of peace and a chance to start anew. He found work as a mechanic, a skill that had served him well in darker times, now a means to rebuild his life. The town's people, though initially wary, gradually came to accept him, his quiet demeanor and hard-working nature slowly winning over their trust. Yet, as he built this new life, there was one piece of his past that remained ever present in his mind: Clara. He thought of her often, wondering where life had taken her, whether she had found peace, or if the war's shadow still lingered in her life. Unable to quell the longing for closure and connection, Erich began to write letters to Clara. He didn't send them, at least not at first. They were a way for him to express all the things he had left unsaid, a means to bridge the gap between the man he was and the man he wanted to be. In these letters he wrote of his life in the small town, of the quiet joys and simple pleasures he had found. He wrote of the changing seasons, the friends he had made, and the slow, steady process of healing. He wrote of his regrets, his hopes, and his continued struggle to make sense of the world after all he had experienced. As the years passed, the letters became a diary of sorts, a record of his journey towards redemption. With each word, he felt a little more of the weight lift from his shoulders, a little more of the past fade into the background. Then, one crisp autumn day, as the leaves began to turn and the air grew cool and clear, Erich made a decision. He gathered the letters, dozens of them, filled with years of thoughts and reflections, and mailed them to Clara. It was a risk, reaching out to her after all this time, not knowing what her life had become or how she would receive his words. But it was a risk he needed to take, a step he needed to make towards truly moving forward. Weeks went by with no response, and Erich began to accept that perhaps the chapter of his life involving Clara was meant to remain closed. Then, one ordinary day, a letter arrived. It was from Clara. Her words were kind, filled with the same warmth and compassion he remembered so well. She wrote of her life after the war, of the struggles and the triumphs, of the family she had raised and the career she had built. She wrote of the pain of the past, but also of the hope for the future. And she wrote of forgiveness, not a dismissal of the past, but an acknowledgement that they had both been caught in the tumultuous tide of history, doing their best to survive and find their way. She thanked him for the letters, for sharing his journey with her, and offered her friendship, a connection rooted not in the shared secrets of war, but in the shared understanding of two people who had seen the worst of times and still dared to hope for the best. Erich's response was simple, a single letter filled with gratitude, hope, and a quiet joy. They continued to correspond, their letters a bridge between two lives that had diverged and now, in some small way, reconverged. As the years turned into decades, the world continued to change, but the friendship that grew out of the ashes of war remained a constant, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Erich Weber, once a spy in the shadows, found light in the forgiveness and friendship of a woman who had every reason to turn away, but chose instead to reach out. And in the end, that was the greatest lesson of all. In a world torn apart by conflict and strife, understanding, compassion, and connection were the true pathways to peace. For Erich, the letters to a lost friend were not just a link to the past, but a beacon for the future, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always a chance for redemption, for change, and for hope. Years had passed since the war's end, and the world had moved on from the ruins of conflict to an era of reconstruction and uneasy peace. Skyscrapers rose ever higher into the skies, children played in streets once torn by warfare, and nations once enemies now sat together at tables discussing the future. In the small Midwestern town, Erich Weber lived a quiet, unassuming life. The locals knew him as Erich, the reserved but friendly mechanic who had an uncanny ability to fix anything that was broken. They were aware of his past, a history he never tried to hide, but they also knew the man he had become. In the community, he was respected, a person who contributed to the town's everyday life, sharing in joys and sorrows alike. As he grew older, Erich's hair turned silver, and the lines on his face deepened, etched with the wisdom and experiences of a life that had seen the very depths of human despair and the redemptive power of hope. His letters to Clara continued, less frequent perhaps, but no less meaningful. They were a tether to a past that both of them had survived, a testament to their enduring connection. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves danced in the gentle breeze, Erich took a walk to the town's memorial park, a tranquil place where a small monument stood honoring those who had served and sacrificed in the war. He sat on a bench, his old bones welcoming the rest, and watched as families and friends paid their respects. The world was not perfect, far from it. There were still conflicts and struggles, pain and injustice. But there was also beauty, resilience, and an ever-present potential for goodness. Erich knew that he was one of the lucky ones, a man who had been given a second chance to find meaning and purpose in a post-war world. As he sat there, lost in thought, a young girl approached him, her hand clutching a bunch of wildflowers. She looked at him with bright, curious eyes and asked if she could sit with him. He nodded, and she climbed onto the bench, placing the flowers between them. They sat in comfortable silence, an old man and a young girl, two generations brought together in a moment of quiet reflection. Erich thought about the letters, the words he had shared with Clara over the years, the stories of redemption, and the lessons learned. He thought about the future, the one that this young girl would inherit, and he felt a surge of responsibility to ensure it was a world worth living in. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light over the park, Erich stood up, thanked the girl for her company, and continued his walk home. He walked with a sense of contentment, a feeling that, despite everything, he had played a part in shaping a better future, however small. The epilogue of Erich Weber's life was not written in grandiose terms or dramatic moments. It was written in the everyday acts of living, in the friendships sustained, the community served, and the quiet commitment to never forget the past but to always strive for a better tomorrow. And as the last light of day faded into the evening, Erich Weber, once a soldier in a war that had almost consumed the world, now a simple man in a small town, looked up at the stars and smiled. For in the vast tapestry of the universe, with all its mysteries and wonders, he had found his place, a small but significant thread woven into the larger story of humanity. And that was enough.